Looking into the haze of Venus, experts have found traces of phosphine, a possible indicator of life.
The Cold War, a fierce battle for supremacy, reaching beyond Earth itself. While the world focused on the moon race and Apollo 11 triumph, the Soviet Union had its sights set elsewhere, Venus. Cloaked in mystery, this hellish world held secrets the USSR was determined to uncover. In this video, you'll discover eerie recordings from Venus, the ghostly remains of a Soviet lunar base, and even the secret development of space-based lasers for an orbital war against the US. Arrival to Apollo. The Soviet Union's response to NASA's Apollo program was a top-secret lunar lander, known as LK or Lunar Korabl. This spacecraft bore a striking resemblance to the Apollo lunar module, but was developed independently as part of the USSR's covert efforts to land a cosmonaut on the moon. Unlike Apollo, which carried 2 astronauts, the Soviet lunar lander was smaller and designed for just 1 cosmonaut. The program aimed not only to achieve a lunar landing, but also to lay the foundation for a permanent moon base, which would have given the Soviet Union a strategic advantage in the ongoing space race. Although the Soviet leadership publicly denied the existence of a manned lunar program, declassified documents from the post-Soviet era confirmed that the USSR was working toward a moon landing. Their efforts hinged on the success of the N-1 rocket, a massive super-heavy lift vehicle intended to rival NASA's Saturn V. The N-1 was expected to deliver up to 95 tons of payload, allowing the Soviet lunar module to reach the moon. However, the rocket's development faced numerous challenges, with all 4 of its test launches between 1969 and 1972 ending in catastrophic failure. The worst failure, on July 3, 1969, resulted in an explosion that destroyed the launch pad and was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. These failures, combined with the untimely death of chief designer Sergei Korolev in 1966, severely hampered the Soviet lunar ambitions. Soviets did not dissuade their dreams of lunar colonization with these setbacks. They were actively drafting plans for some Zvezda permanently housing moon base, focusing on self-sustainability rather than missions with great short-term propensities. Engineers developed self-burrowing lunar habitats that would dig into the moon's surface as construction for cosmonaut habitation against cosmic radiation and micrometeorite entry. Their projection, had they gotten it launched, would have housed 4 to 12 cosmonauts, making the Soviet effort in lunar habitat much more ambitious than the NASA Apollo missions. But by the time the Soviet lunar lander was ready to be tested in 1969, it was too late. The US had already claimed victory in the space race with Apollo 11 momentous landing on the moon on July 20, 1969. Soviet leaders responded to mounting political and economic pressures by switching from manned missions to lunar exploration, which turned into the Venera program for Venus. The demise of the N-1 rocket obviated the Soviet moon program, for which the vision of establishing a lunar colony regrouped but remained unachieved. While most of the narrative on the front pages of the newspapers in the late 1960s was about NASA's Apollo missions, the secretive lunar endeavors of the USSR created one of the most intriguing what-ifs of this period: the Cold War-era space race. We're just getting started. What's next will leave you speechless. Project Zvezda. Project Zvezda was the Soviet Union's ambitious plan to establish a permanent lunar base, envisioned as a long-term outpost for cosmonauts. Unlike NASA's Apollo program, which focused on short-term moon landings, the Soviets aimed for a self-sustaining lunar colony that could support 4 to 12 crew members. Soviet engineers, led by Vladimir Barmin, designed modular habitats that would be buried under the lunar soil to protect against radiation and micrometeorites. These structures were intended to include living quarters, science labs, a gym, a kitchen, and even greenhouses, where cosmonauts could grow food using lunar soil. The ultimate goal of Zvezda was to secure Soviet dominance on the moon by creating a permanent human presence. The success of Project Zvezda depended entirely on the N-1 Super Heavy lift rocket, which was crucial for transporting both cosmonauts and construction materials to the Moon. The plan required 3 years of continuous rocket launches to build the base. However, the N-1 rocket suffered repeated catastrophic failures, with all 4 test flights between 1969 and 1972 ending in disaster. Without a reliable launch vehicle, the Soviet Union was unable to transport the necessary equipment, effectively dooming the project. The 4th and final N-1 test, in November 1972, was the most promising, but a stage separation failure led to another explosion. The failure of the N-1 rocket was so severe that its development was officially cancelled in 1974, forcing Soviet engineers to look for alternative methods, including the Vulcan rocket, which was never completed. Zvezda has become more than an engineering dream. It came to be prototyped before it was left behind. The Soviets even went so far as to create an entirely automated self-burrowing habitation, a cylindrical structure with spiral blades that would be able to drill 4.5 hours to an underneath level of the lunar surface. This masterpiece design would have guaranteed cosmonaut security in a safe underground shelter once they arrived. There are reports that the Soviets secretly landed an unmanned probe on the Moon with a 3-ton rover inside to test this idea sometime in 1982. This mission was alleged to be part of the Lunar program, but was seldom officially confirmed. Nonetheless, with the demise of the Soviet space program, hardly any documentation exists to prove that anything has been physically realized belonging to Project Zvezda. By the mid-1980s, Zvezda had pretty much given up due to the economic deterioration and the general turnaround priorities within the Soviet space program. This gave the project the dubious honor of being the most expensive abandoned space facility in history, with an estimated cost of $80 billion. Some declassified Soviet documents refer to the termination of this project, but others suggest that experiments with lunar outposts continued under wraps. Several reports also say that parts of the design of Zvezda were later used in modules for space stations, such as for Mir. Now, with NASA's Artemis program planning a return to the Moon sometime in the 2020s, speculation is mounting as to whether Zvezda's skeletons lie buried beneath the surface of the Moon itself, awaiting rediscovery. The Soviet Venus missions. The Soviet Union's Venera program was one of the most ambitious interplanetary exploration efforts in history, aiming to explore Venus, Earth's closest planetary neighbor. In the early 1960s, Soviet scientists believed that Venus might have vast, warm oceans based on limited telescope observations and theoretical models. This speculation was even reflected in Soviet cinema, such as the 1961 sci-fi film Planet of Storms, which depicted Soviet cosmonauts swimming in Venusian waters. However, as early robotic probes reached the planet, the truth about Venus proved far more hostile than expected. The Soviet Union launched the first ever interplanetary probe, Venera 1, in 1961, but contact was lost before it could transmit data. Despite early failures, the USSR continued sending missions to Venus, determined to make history. By the late 1960s, the Soviets achieved a significant milestone with Venera 3, which became the first spacecraft to reach another planet's atmosphere on March 1, 1966. However, due to overheating, data was not sent back. Learning from these setbacks, the USSR developed more heat-resistant probes, such as Venera 4, 5, and 6, which successfully entered Venus's atmosphere and sent back crucial data about its composition. The biggest revelation came when scientists discovered that Venus's atmosphere was 97% carbon dioxide, with temperatures exceeding 475 degrees Celsius or 887 degrees Fahrenheit, and surface pressures 90 times higher than Earth's. The dream of Soviet Venusian colonies was shattered. Venus was not a tropical paradise, but a planet with an acidic, high-pressure inferno. Soviet engineers designed reinforced landers using titanium and ceramic shields to withstand the hostile environment of Venus. Reaching the surface was their aim. The effort came through during Venera 7 in 1970, which eventually became the first spacecraft to land on another planet and transmit data to Earth. It lasted only 23 minutes before being crushed by the intense heat and pressure of Venus. Over the next decade, Venera 9 and 10 provided the first ever images of the surface of Venus in 1975. These displayed a desolate, rocky wasteland, concealed by thick clouds. All these missions proved that Venus was entirely inhospitable, but they also brought a substantial victory to the Soviet space program, as the USSR beat NASA in a race to image any other planet's surface. So, the crowning glory of the Venera project came in 1982, with Venera 13 and 14, which returned the first and only color panoramas of Venus and even recorded the otherworldly sounds of its atmosphere. It collected thunder-like rumbles, probably from distant thunder, in the sulfuric acid clouds. These recordings and images are among the most haunting data ever collected from another world. The historic success of the program came to an end sometime later, post the beginning of the decline of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. Currently, NASA and Roscosmos are planning missions to Venus again. However, no other spacecraft has survived as long as the Soviet Venera landers on this hellish planet. USSR's interplanetary dreams. The Soviet Union's interplanetary ambitions extended far beyond the Moon and Venus, with bold plans to colonize other worlds and establish permanent human settlements in space. In the early 1960s, Soviet scientists were optimistic about the possibility of finding habitable conditions on other planets, particularly Venus and Mars. At the time, limited astronomical observations suggested that Venus might have vast oceans and a mild climate, leading Soviet engineers to consider it a potential candidate for colonization. This idea was popularized by Soviet science fiction, including the 1961 film Planet of Storms, which depicted Soviet cosmonauts exploring a lush, tropical Venus. However, as actual space missions gathered more data, the reality turned out to be far different from the optimistic assumptions. The Venera program played a crucial role in uncovering the true conditions of Venus, revealing it to be a hostile inferno with suffocating carbon dioxide clouds, sulfuric acid rain, and surface temperatures hot enough to melt lead. Despite these setbacks, Soviet engineers did not give up on interplanetary exploration. Instead, they shifted their focus toward Mars, believing it to be a more promising candidate for future colonization. Throughout the 1970s, the USSR launched a series of Mars probes, including Mars 3 on December 2, 1971, which became the first spacecraft to successfully land on the Martian surface, although it lost communication just seconds after the touchdown. The Soviet Union also planned to send rovers and even human missions to Mars, but these ambitions never materialized due to technical challenges and economic difficulties. Aside from that, long-term space habitats are envisioned by the USSR for deep space colonization in the future. The Almaz military space stations launched in the 1970s were envisaged for research, not only but also for potential military applications, with defense or offense options in orbit. Thus, these were the precursor to more advanced ones like Mir, the first modular space station, and ultimately a precursor to the International Space Station or ISS. Some have speculated that if Soviet space programs had not collapsed, there would have been more ambitious projects, such as a permanent Martian outpost, or manned missions to the outer planets. Many interplanetary dreams of the former Soviet Union continue to cast shadows in modern space exploration, even after its dissolution in 1991. Space agencies today, such as NASA, Roscosmos, and China's CNSA, work toward Mars missions, lunar bases, and deep space travel ideas that once prided themselves on being only theoretical by the USSR's standards. Some of the advanced technology and engineering principles developed for the Venera, Mars, and lunar programs are still in use today. A failed moonshot. The Soviet Union's failed moonshot was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the space race, as the USSR aimed to land a cosmonaut on the Moon before the United States. While the Americans had openly committed to the Apollo program, the Soviets denied they were working on a manned lunar mission. However, Declassified documents revealed that the USSR had a covert plan to send a cosmonaut to the moon using the N-1 rocket and a lunar lander similar to the Apollo lunar module. Unlike the American mission, which carried 2 astronauts to the moon's surface, the Soviet lunar lander was designed for just 1 cosmonaut. The plan was to have them collect samples and plant the Soviet flag before returning to lunar orbit, where they would dock with a waiting command module. If successful, this would have been a major propaganda victory for the USSR. However, the Soviet plan depended entirely on the success of the N-1 Super Heavy Lift rocket, the USSR's equivalent of the American Saturn V. The N-1 was designed to carry 232 tons of payload, making it the largest and most powerful rocket ever built by the USSR. Unfortunately, its development was rushed, and the rocket was never fully tested before launch. Between 1969 and 1972, the N-1 was launched 4 times, and all 4 attempts ended in catastrophic failure. The worst disaster occurred during the second launch, when a faulty fuel line caused an explosion so massive that it destroyed the entire launch complex, setting back the Soviet lunar program by years. The repeated failures of the N-1 made it clear that the USSR could not send a manned mission to the moon in time to compete with the US. Also, aggravating loss was tied to the demise of Sergei Korolev in 1966, the chief Soviet rocket engineer and architect of Sputnik and Vostok. After that, the guidance for the Soviet space program was rather diffuse and unclear. While the United States had a unified NASA towards a single end, the Soviet space program was marked by bureaucratic infighting and rivalry among the different design bureaus. Consequently, while NASA, in July 1969, successfully had Apollo 11 on the moon, the test flight of the N-1 rocket in the USSR was still awaited. Lost with that victory for America, Soviet leaders quietly buried any hope of a manned lunar program for fear of being embarrassed, and even went to the destruction of records that chronicled anything to do with it. By 1976, the N-1 project was officially cancelled, and Soviet engineers turned their attention to space stations and interplanetary probes. The USSR later enjoyed a monopoly on long-term habitation in space thanks to the Mir space station, but cosmonauts never made it to the moon. Things are about to get even more intense. Prepare for a game-changing twist. Cold War space weapons. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union not only sought to dominate space exploration, but also explored the possibility of space-based warfare. While publicly promoting peaceful space missions, the USSR secretly developed military space stations and orbital weapons to counter potential threats from the United States. One of the most ambitious projects was Almaz, a classified military space station program that ran parallel to the Salyut space station program. Officially, Salyut stations were used for scientific research, but some were military reconnaissance platforms disguised as civilian missions. The ultimate goal was to establish armed outposts in orbit, allowing the Soviet Union to monitor and, if necessary, engage enemy satellites or spacecraft. The most infamous Soviet space weapon was the 23mm space cannon, which was secretly installed on Salyut 3, a military space station launched in 1974. This fully operational space gun had a firing rate of up to 2,500 rounds per minute and was designed to shoot down enemy satellites or spacecraft. On January 24, 1975, the weapon was reportedly tested in orbit, firing 20 rounds at a target satellite. However, details about the test remain classified, and the fate of the targeted object is unknown. One of the major problems with using traditional firearms in space was recoil, which could alter the trajectory of the station itself. This challenge, along with the difficulty of aiming and maneuvering a large space station for combat, led Soviet engineers to explore alternative weaponry. Out of all the various types of space weaponry designed during the Cold War, none was more unique than a Soviet laser handgun with which cosmonauts were to disable enemy satellites. Developed by the Almaz program, this small laser could fire through glass in a space station, so cosmonauts could blind the optical systems of American satellites without having to make a spacewalk. Unlike regular firearms, however, this laser weapon had no recoil, making it far more practical in zero gravity. However, in 1984, the relationships began to shift and economic troubles deepened. The project was quietly terminated before initialization. All spaceships were to become more advanced weaponry. Though proven by the Soviet Union, none of these systems was active in their fights. As the USSR faced severe political and economic challenges at the start of the 1990s, so too did its space programs start to decline in its arms race with the United States, the country which at the same time was itself working with a Star Wars initiative known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, to develop space-based missile defense systems. When in fact these projects could live during the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR in 1991, these were declassified and cancelled. Today, space is largely demilitarized. However, there are renewed tensions across the globe. Project Horizon. Project Horizon was a top-secret plan developed by the United States Department of Defense in response to fears that the Soviet Union was gaining the upper hand in the space race. In 1959, Soviet officials publicly declared their intentions to send cosmonauts to the Moon and establish a permanent lunar base. Concerned that the USSR might use the Moon for military purposes, the US Army proposed Project Horizon, a plan to construct a military outpost on the lunar surface. The idea was to deploy American soldiers to the Moon, where they would maintain a strategic advantage over the Soviets and prevent them from gaining control of Earth's only natural satellite. The proposal outlined a fully operational lunar base, capable of housing a garrison of 12 soldiers by the mid-1960s. The plan was highly ambitious and required an enormous logistical effort. To establish the base, the US Army estimated that it would take 50 launches of the Saturn I rocket, a precursor to the Saturn V used in the Apollo missions. These launches would deliver cylindrical habitat modules, which would be buried under lunar soil to protect the crew from radiation and micrometeorites. The base was also expected to include a power station, living quarters, a command center, and storage for supplies and weapons. One of the most controversial aspects of Project Horizon was the proposal to deploy nuclear weapons on the Moon, which would serve as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. The military believed that controlling the Moon could provide a tactical advantage in any future space-based conflicts. Since it was projected to cost about $6 billion at the time, counting the fact that many of the technologies required for the long-term habitation of the Moon had not yet been in existence failed in the end. Furthermore, the military occupation had halted when newly created NASA took over the responsibilities for lunar exploration. This was made apparent when, in 1962, President John F. Kennedy announced that the United States would land a civilian astronaut on the Moon by the end of that decade. By then, Project Horizon had already become increasingly obsolete, as the US had redirected efforts to the Apollo program instead of developing a militarized lunar base. That redirected effort led to the moon landing in 1969. Although it was never realized, Project Horizon demonstrated just how seriously the military of the United States considered the Moon to be a strategic resource during the Cold War. The notion of a military presence in space emerged again in the recent past, with the establishment of the US Space Force, which would secure American dominance while orbiting the Earth. At present, modern missions to the Moon, such as NASA's Artemis program, have revived the idea of permanent lunar habitats, albeit without military control, and instead focused on science and international collaboration. The space race. The space race was one of the most intense competitions of the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union vied for dominance in space exploration. It officially began in 1957 when the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, shocking the world and proving that Soviet rocket technology had surpassed American capabilities. The Soviets continued their lead with a series of historic firsts, including Yuri Gagarin's flight aboard Vostok 1 in 1961, making him the first human in space. In response, US President John F. Kennedy delivered his famous 1962 speech, committing the United States to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This decision led to the creation of NASA's Apollo program, which became the centerpiece of America's space ambitions. While in the United States, it was heralded as an Apollo project for publicity, in reality, the Soviet Union went about its own manned lunar program in complete secrecy. As such, there evolved the N-1 rocket, a gigantic behemoth in the launching form meant for blasting off the USSR in the face of NASA's Saturn V. There was also an Apollo-type lunar lander, but designed with the consideration that it would touch down only one cosmonaut. On the other hand, between 1969 and 1972, history was punctuated by 4 catastrophic failures in tests by the N-1 rocket. The Soviet Union's dreams now were going under in becoming the first to venture into the moon's surface. The Soviets remained unable to answer the Apollo 11 launch, which took place on July 16, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history on July 20th by becoming the first humans to walk on the surface of the moon. Thereupon, the State Department for the occasion kept a top secret the failed moon program of the USSR, which in time diverted its focus to space stations and toward planetary missions. The Soviets lost the race to the moon, but continued to be the leaders in space innovation in other areas. They developed long-duration human spaceflights and initiated the launch of humanity's first space station, Salyut-1, in 1971. Subsequently, the first modular space station called Mir was developed, which proved to be a predecessor to the International Space Station, or ISS. The USSR was also very much the dominant interplanetary exploring country with its Venera program that landed the first probes on Venus and took the first images in 1975 from the surface of another planet. The official end of the space race came with the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, which saw American and Soviet astronauts docked in orbit with one another, the first cooperative act between the two space powers. But for decades, numerous other classified projects by the Soviet Union, including moon bases and space weapons, remained a secret, leaving many what-if scenarios that lure contemporary historians of space. Unfinished missions. The Soviet Union's space program was filled with ambitious projects, but many of them remained unfinished due to technological limitations, financial struggles, or political shifts. One of the most significant abandoned missions was the Soviet lunar program, which aimed to land a cosmonaut on the moon before the United States. The entire plan depended on the N-1 Super Heavy rocket, designed to carry a one-person lunar lander similar to the Apollo lunar module. However, between 1969 and 1972, the N-1 rocket failed all 4 test launches, with one explosion in July 1969 destroying the launch pad. Without a functional launch system, the Soviet Union was unable to proceed with manned lunar landings, leading to the quiet cancellation of the program in 1974. Soviet officials kept this failure highly classified, even destroying some records to prevent their moon race defeat from being publicly acknowledged. Another unfinished Soviet mission was Project Zvezda, which envisioned a permanent Soviet lunar base. Unlike NASA's Apollo program, which focused on short-term stays, Zvezda was designed to support 4 to 12 cosmonauts for extended periods, using self-burrowing lunar habitats covered with moon soil for protection against radiation and micrometeorites. However, with the failure of the N-1 rocket, the USSR had no way to transport the necessary modules to the moon, and by the mid-1980s, the project was quietly abandoned. Some reports suggest that in 1982, the Soviets secretly sent a 3-ton lunar rover to test self-burrowing technology, but there is no conclusive evidence that any of these designs were ever deployed. Had the N-1 rocket been successful, the USSR might have built the first moon colony decades before NASA's Artemis program. In addition to moon missions, the Soviet Union also had interplanetary missions that were never completed. The Venera program consisted of many successful probes on Venus's surface, but the Soviets originally intended to build more advanced robotic missions, including landers that were able to survive and operate for prolonged periods. Soviet Mars probes, such as Mars 3 in 1971, had somewhat successful results. But original plans to send humans to Mars will never be realized due to financial constraints and technological hurdles that have yet to be overcome. On the military side was the Almaz space station program that included plans for armed reconnaissance stations, such as the 1975 test of a 23mm space cannon on Salyut 3. But these space-based weapons projects ended quietly during the late 1980s. Most of these unfinished projects became buried in the wreckage of the Soviet Union in 1991. But modern space agencies are building upon those early technological foundations laid by the USSR's early programs. The past may have been unfinished, but the future is full of incredible possibilities. Future lunar and Venusian exploration. The next era of lunar and Venusian exploration is set to fulfill many of the ambitions first envisioned by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. NASA's Artemis program, scheduled to land astronauts on the Moon by the 2030s, aims to establish a long-term lunar base, much like the Soviet project Zvezda. Unlike the Apollo missions, which focused on short-term visits, Artemis will create a sustainable human presence with habitats, power stations, and research facilities, concepts that mirror Soviet lunar-based designs from the 1960s. Meanwhile, Roscosmos and China's CNSA have announced their joint lunar base project, signaling a potential new space race with international partnerships. Modern lunar bases will rely on many of the same principles developed for Soviet moon plans, such as using lunar soil for radiation shielding and leveraging nuclear power for energy. The renewed focus on permanent moon settlements reflects a shift toward deep space colonization, a dream once held by Soviet engineers like Vladimir Barmin. Apart from lunar study, Venus is again centered on planetary studies. The two missions of NASA, which is Veritas and Da Vinci Plus, are now scheduled in the next 2030s for giving a detailed map of Venus, as well as understanding its mysterious chemical composition in its atmosphere that will be built upon the information earlier collected from the Soviet Venera program. Roscosmos has laid out plans for Venera D, which is to be a modern probe that landed on Venus's surface and potentially last much longer than Soviet landers, who were there only minutes in the sweltering heat and crushing pressure. Scientists, nowadays, would point out that Venus may once have had oceans, creating the possibility of microbial life in its past, the theory that maybe also could be tested out by future missions. The 20th century's stellar program that took place in the history of Venera significantly opened many avenues for future Venus explorations and proved that Soviet planetary dreams would continue to drive modern space exploration even some decades later. That's it for today's deep dive into the Soviet Union's secret space missions. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more mind-blowing space history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments which space mystery you'd like us to cover next. And if you're hungry for more, check out the next video on the screen for another incredible space exploration story.